Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Katie Bao. I'm a research specialist with the North Carolina Community College System Office. First, could someone just confirm that you can hear me okay? I was having a little bit of feedback in my last session. Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So I am going to share my screen. Unfortunately, I'm working from a single screen today, so I won't be able to answer questions as I'm presenting, but I'll stop every so often to check for questions. So today I'll be sharing some of our dual enrollment dashboards with you all. You should be able to see my screen now. To access our dashboards, if you go to ncommunitycolleges.edu and then click on this little hamburger menu over here, you can see analytics and reporting. This is the research and performance management page. And if you click on read more here under dashboards, you can see all of our dashboards. So all of our dual enrollment dashboards can be found under this high school dual enrollment link. And this lists all the dashboards that we have. So today I'm going to start with just summarizing the dashboards that we have that are related to dual enrollment. And then I'm also, because we have so many different pages on all of our dashboards, I'm not going to do in-depth with each of the dashboards, but rather give you a sense of what's on the dashboards and then talk about some of the insights that you can pull from these dashboards. So here's our summary dashboard. This just kind of provides links to each of the dashboards that we have and an overview of some of the biggest numbers coming out of these. So for example, one of our dashboards is our dual enrollment program dashboards. This should give you a sense of how many students are enrolled in dual enrollment by pathway, by college, by various demographics. It includes some course taking behavior as well, so percentage of students taking online classes, for example. Then we have our dual enrollment course outcomes and grades. And this dashboard provides information term by term, year by year, looking at course success rates and grade distributions for our CCP students by pathway. And the dual enrollment rate dashboard provides this is a slightly different dashboard. This is looking at, of all of the public and charter high school students in North Carolina, what proportion of those students are participating in dual enrollment. And then the last set of dashboards that we have are all looking at sort of longer term outcomes for our dual enrollment students. So we recognize that the different pathways have different goals. So I've divided these dashboards up by pathway. So we have a set for a transfer pathway for CTE and for our cooperative innovative high schools. And for each of those, we provide an institutional deep dive into some long-term outcome metrics for that pathway, as well as a peer comparison dashboard to allow you to see, okay, if we're seeing, say, equity gaps in certain outcomes, are those similar to other institutions that are like mine? So I'm going to go through a little bit on each of these dashboards so you can get a sense of what's there and also talk about some of the possible insights that you could draw from these. So I'll start with the dual enrollment programs dashboard. So this dashboard here, and if you haven't used any of our dashboards, all of our filters will always be over here on the right. And for every dashboard that we have this metrics details page, which describes what's in the dashboard, how we calculated what's in the dashboard, and also where the data came from. And then we also provide information on when this dashboard was last updated, what's the most recent data, and when do you expect the next update. So we just got in our spring data, so I'll be updating all of these dashboards over the next couple of weeks. So back to the main page. This dashboard is looking at enrollment in dual enrollment over time. So you can see right here, this is showing that over time, we've increased the number of students in dual enrollment. And if we want to look at that by pathway, we can see this green line here has the biggest jump. This is our college transfer pathway. So in fall of 19, we had a change in eligibility requirements for transfer pathway. And as a result, we saw a lot more students start to participate in that pathway. And as that happened, we also saw a decline in the number of CTE students, that's this blue line here, participating. So that's showing, we can see the effects of that policy change in the data. And that suggests that perhaps in the past, some of the CTE students who were enrolled in the CTE pathway really maybe wanted to be in the transfer pathway but weren't eligible. So perhaps in the future, then our CTE pathway may better reflect students who are actually interested in CTE programs. Now, I don't have spring data uploaded into this yet, but I will very soon. The most recent data I have is fall. So if we want to try to get a sense of the impact of COVID here, we can see we had that really big increase in transfer student participation, and that's kind of leveled off from fall 19 to fall 20. And we've seen that kind of across the CCP program, that enrollment's been increasing over time, but then with our most recent data, post-COVID, we're seeing a kind of leveling off, but not a decrease. So we see that leveling off. We're seeing a continued decline for our CTE pathway participation. And if we look over here, this is showing the share of all dual enrollment. So the percentage of all CCP students who are transfer pathway students was 29% in fall of 15. And now we're up to 55%. So over half of our CCP students are now transfer pathway students. So we've seen some changes there. And if we go to demographics here, one thing I should mention, if you're interested in a particular college, you can select that on any of these pages. And that will show you that college compared to the system, or you can select another college. For today, I'm going to leave things on the system for the most part so that we can look at system trends. But if you're interested in your particular college, you can select that. So what we see is that over time, we've had more female CCP students than male students. This isn't surprising. We see this kind of across the country. But one thing we are seeing is that this discrepancy is increasing over time. So this equity gap that we have in terms of access is increasing. And for our most recent term, fall 2020, 62% of all CCP students were female. Now, this does differ by pathway, and for any of these, you can go in and select pathways. So for example, CTE, we actually see the opposite, that we have a greater proportion of male students, 55% are male compared to female. And transfer pathway is our most heavily female pathway, where 65% of all students are female. For race and ethnicity, we can see that the majority of our students are white. That's this orange line here. And as of our most recent term, 60% of all of our CCP students are white. And again, that differs by pathway. So our cooperative innovative high schools are most diverse. About 49% of students in our early colleges are white, 20% Hispanic, 15% Black. Our transfer pathway is the least diverse, with 67% of all CCP students in the transfer pathway are white. And then if we look at that intersection, we can see here that our most populous group are white females. That's this white line here. And we see that across the country. That's not something that's specific to North Carolina, that white female students are the most represented, followed by white male students. One thing that I think we should take away from this is that, so enrollment in CCPs kind of flatlined a little bit during COVID, but what we see is that that's not equal across groups. So white females have actually increased a bit from fall 19 to fall 20. Pretty much every other group has decreased. We see a decrease in the number of white male students, a decrease in the number of Black female students, a decrease in the number of Black male students, et cetera. So for all of our group, Hispanic females, Hispanic males, we're seeing decreases. The only group that's continuing to increase are white females. So we're seeing these equity gaps that exist, and with COVID, it doesn't seem to be getting better. If anything, it's getting worse. Now, when you look at this, you may say, well, maybe there just are a lot more white female students in the state than some of these other groups. So another set of dashboards that I have are the dual enrollment rate. And this gives you a better sense of, I think, access in terms of CCP across different demographic groups. So with this dashboard, this is looking at all high school students who are at public and charter high schools in North Carolina. We can't include private and charter here just because we don't have data on all of those students. So with this, we're using data from the Department of Public Instruction to get information on the number of high school students. So that's why it's limited to public and charters. This graph here shows the total number of high school students over the years, and this blue bar here is showing the increase in the number of CCP students. So in the 13-14 school year, about 6% of all public and charter high school students were dually enrolled. We're up to 12% in 1920. We can look at that by various demographics. 15% of all female high school students were dually enrolled in 1920. Only 9% of male students were dually enrolled. And again, we can see those proportions over time, and we can see that gap's increasing. If we look at race and ethnicity, 15% of all white high school students were dually enrolled. Only 7% of Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, only 8% of Black students. So again, we've had these gaps over time, but they seem to be increasing. So equity in terms of access is getting worse in CCP over time rather than better. And then I think this is probably the most striking page from this dashboard. If we look at that cross between sex and race ethnicity, we see that 18% of white female students are dually enrolled. It's almost a fifth of our white female high school population. Only 5% of our Black male high school students are dually enrolled. And only 7% of our Hispanic male high school students are dually enrolled. And again, we see those differences there are increasing over time. And then if we looked at the enrollment from the previous dashboard, we saw that enrollment was continuing to increase for white females, but was declining for all other groups. So I think once we can get the 2021 data in here, I think these will only, these inequities will only continue to increase for the time being. So that suggests that maybe there are steps that colleges can take to try to intentionally outreach to these groups to try to get more equitable access to dual enrollment. Because if you attended our last session where we talked about some of the impacts of dual enrollment, we see positive impacts of dual enrollment on students. But if students aren't equitably accessing the program, then that's going to be problematic for looking at equitable success in terms of our high school students. So those are first two dashboards. Another dashboard, so those two kind of get an idea of access to dual enrollment. If we want to look at success, we can look at course outcomes and grades. So that's this dashboard here. So for this dashboard, instead of looking at it in terms of students, this is looking at enrollments. So if a student takes 2 courses, they'd be included twice in this graph right here. So this is the total number of graded enrollments. So we can see similar trends in that the number of enrollments in the transfer pathway is increasing over time. Number of enrollments in the CTE pathway is starting to decrease over time. I'm going to switch this to fall term because that's our most recent data, so we can see some of the COVID impacts here. So this graph right here is looking at success rate. So the proportion of all of these graded enrollments that were in A, B, C, or P. So students were successful in the course. Now this gray line right here are our non-dually enrolled students, and all of the color lines up here are CCP students. So you can see that regardless of pathway, our CCP students are outperforming the non-CCP students at the colleges. But if you want to see for a particular pathway, you can click over here to kind of highlight it. So we can see success rates in the transfer pathway are decreasing slightly over time. That even preceded COVID, but it's not a huge decrease. For CTE pathway, we see a decrease from fall 19 to fall 20, but again, it's not a huge effect, and we see similar across all these pathways. Where we do see a decline. We're seeing a decline in success rates post-COVID, but it's not a huge decline. And if we look at average course grades, they're pretty steady over time. We do see an increase in withdrawal rates across all the pathways from fall 19 to fall 20. So we can see impacts of COVID here, but they're not huge impacts so far from what we can see. And for this dashboard, I'm not going to go into all of this, but you can also see these graphs by instructional area. So for example, Gen Ed versus CTE, or instructional method. If you want to see for online classes in particular, what were my success rates, you can do that. And surprisingly, we've seen a big increase in the number of online enrollments, particularly for transfer pathway in early college. You can also look at it by subject, look at grade distributions, etc. So then the last set of dashboards we have are an attempt to kind of get at longer term outcomes. So that the course outcomes dashboard is looking at for a particular term or for a particular year. But if we want to know how are students doing during their entire CCP career, or what are they doing after they graduate high school, that's what these last sets of dashboards are, these cohort outcomes dashboards. So I have these split up by pathway. We have transfer pathway, CTE pathway, cooperative innovative. And then for each of those, there's kind of an institutional deep dive where you can see what are the differences across different demographic groups for your institution, and then peer comparisons where you can compare institutions. So I'll just go through transfer pathway. All the dashboards are pretty similar, but the exact metrics used differ by dashboard. So here's our transfer pathway cohort outcomes dashboard. So for this dashboard, we have 4 different metrics of success. We recognize that with the different dashboard or with the different pathways, we might want to measure success differently. So for example, I have some measure of credit accumulation for every pathway, but the types of credit hours that we're looking at differs by pathway. So for transfer, we're expecting these students to want to transfer to a 4-year most likely. So for this credit accumulation, we're looking at the median number of successful UGETSI hours of transfer pathway high school graduates. So UGETSI hours are hours that are courses that are part of the Comprehensive Articulation Agreement. So all of these hours should transfer to any public 4-year in the state. So here we can see the median number of those successful transferable hours of transfer pathway students who graduate high school in 2020 was 9. So that's the total number that they accumulated as a CCP student. Now that's I could say a fairly low number. That means that on average, our students are not completing a pathway. So that's a metric where perhaps there's room for improvement across the system. And if you want to see for your particular college, you can select a college and it'll update for that college. So I'm going to focus on this particular metric to give you a sense of what you can find. For every one of our metrics, we have kind of this deep dive into the different demographic groups. So for a credit accumulation, we can see we have that median number of successful hours here. But this also gives you a breakdown of how many students earned no successful hours. So these could be students that either didn't take any UGETSI courses or didn't pass any of their UGETSI courses. So 10% of all of our transfer pathway students who graduated high school in 2020 left high school with no UGETSI hours. On the other hand, we had 9% of students who earned 30 or more hours as part of the transfer pathway. And what I think is most useful for these dashboards is to look at these success rates and metrics by sex and race ethnicity. So here you can see for this metric of credit accumulation, we do see that females are outperforming males. So females are accumulating more of these credits than male students. And you can see that distribution too. So we see a much higher percentage of female students earning 30 or more hours compared to males. We see more males earning no hours compared to females. And for each of these metrics, you can get an idea now of equity differences in terms of success. So we looked at access in some of the earlier dashboards. Here it gives you a sense in terms of success. And what we find is that it really differs by metric and by college. So with some metrics, we're not really seeing any equity gaps. With other metrics, we're seeing fairly large equity gaps. And for some colleges, we're not really seeing gaps. For other colleges, we are. So I encourage you to look at these dashboards and really play around with them to get a sense of what are the gaps at your institution. If we move on to race and ethnicity, we can see that white students are accumulating the most number of credits, whereas Black students are only accumulating about 6 on average. So that's a pretty big gap there for credit hours. And then again, if we look at this intersection by sex and race and ethnicity, we see that our white students are accumulating the highest number of credits, and Black and Hispanic males are accumulating the lowest number. So we saw that our white female students are accessing our CCP programs at higher rates than our male minorities, and we're seeing similar outcomes in terms of success for at least some of our metrics, but not for all of them. So you can kind of look into this deep dive with any of these metrics here, and then if you see equity gaps at your institution, I think it's also helpful to kind of put those into context of what are these gaps like at other institutions? Are they similar at my institution compared to other institutions like mine? So here is one of our peer comparison dashboards. These are the same 4 metrics that we saw on the previous dashboard. And here, if you select a college, it will show you where your college falls relative to the others. So each of these dots represents a college, and if you select your college, then your college will appear as this kind of goldish color. So you can get a sense, where do I fall relative to all the other colleges? I think this can also be helpful for if you want to, say, improve your credit accumulation. So Alamance here has the same mean as the system. You can say, okay, what are some of these outliers here? And maybe I could reach out to them and see what are they doing to get these higher success rates, and what can I do to try to improve my program? So for this one, you have to select a college, and once you select a college, on the next tab, it will fill in the different peer groups. So this is showing neighboring colleges that are geographically close to the selected college, colleges that are similar in terms of size, and here we're using FTE for size, colleges that have similar proportion of enrollment of students under 18 years old, so it's kind of a proxy for CCP, colleges that have similar proportion of minority students enrolled, ethnic minority, colleges that are in the same prosperity zone, and then colleges that are in the same county distress tier. And these come from Commerce. So 1 and 2 are more economically distressed than tier 3. And on this page, if there's specific colleges you want to compare to, you can also just select up to 5 colleges, and you'll get results for those colleges as well. So I'm just going to randomly select a few here. So then again, for each of these, I'm going to stick with credit accumulation because that's what we did on the first one. Your college will appear in this kind of gold color, and you can get a sense of where you are relative to the other colleges. And if you want to say, okay, what does it look like for the different sizes of college? You can get a sense from the largest to the smallest, or I guess smallest to largest colleges. Are there any trends? Where do I fall relative to other colleges of my size? So you can do that for any of these different peer groupings. And then if you go to each of these, you can get the actual means or medians, depending on the metric, for those peer groupings. So here's the median number of hours for Alamance that were accumulated. Here's the median for the entire system. Here's the median for other colleges that are about the same size. And if you forget who's in any of these groups, if you hover over this little icon here, it will fill in with the colleges that make up this mean or median. And then any other colleges you select will be available down here at the bottom. So I think this is probably most helpful for when we start to look into these different demographic breakdowns. So here we can see Alamance has a gap where female students are outperforming male students, like we see at the system. Their male students are kind of in line with the system, but their female students are outperforming female students at the system level, which leads to a larger gap. But then you can see what are the relative performances of these two groups across these different peer groupings, and also what's the size of the gap. So you can get a sense of, is what we're seeing at our institution similar to what we're seeing at other institutions like ours. And we have the same thing with race and ethnicity, and with sex and race ethnicity. And for here, sometimes if you're interested in particular groups, you may want to click on them because they can sometimes hide behind other dots if there are multiple groups that are in one that have the same number. And if you want to compare, you can click on one and then shift click on another, and it'll select those, or control click to just do two. So you can kind of see just that specific gap relative to others. Now, sometimes one of these dots may be missing, and that just means that group has less than 20 people in it. So we want to protect student privacy, so any groups that have fewer than 20 people will be suppressed for anything that's an outcome. And then lastly, we also have that intersection between sex and race ethnicity. But again, if some of these groups end up being kind of small, which they are at many colleges, then they're suppressed. So depending on the size of your college, you may be able to get more out of some of these than others. So that was kind of a very quick run through of some of the types of conclusions that you can draw from these dashboards. Again, there's a lot of data in these dashboards, a lot to look through. So I encourage you to go through and do that. At this point, I'm going to head back to the studio and ask what questions we have. I see there's already some in the chat, and feel free to add more in, and I will address these as we go through. Okay, so going back. What was the change in eligibility that resulted in higher number for transfer? So if I remember correctly, I believe we went from requiring a 2.8 weighted GPA to a 3.0 unweighted GPA. And also, it used to be you had to have a certain GPA and meet the requirements for, what's the term? For college ready, but now it's one or the other. So the end result is that more students were able to be eligible and thus participate. Okay, I see someone shared the link. I shared that in the chat earlier too. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in, and I'm happy to stick around and answer them. And again, I encourage you to go to the dashboard link there and play around with them. And if you have any questions, you can also email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if anything comes to you later on, after you're exploring the dashboard, feel free to email me. But also, if you have any questions right now, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, Tony's saying that we found our early college students negatively impacted our transfer performance measure in the past year. Is there a way to get the raw data for this group so we can dig into the reasons behind this issue? Yeah, so for the performance measures, we've placed that raw data on, oh, I'm losing the word for it now, and Power BI. So whoever is the data person for your institution should be able to give you or can provide you information on that data. We have only one person per institution who is able to grant that access, but if you can reach out to them, they should be able to get you what you need. And then John is saying, are private colleges including in the transfer information concerning CCP? So are you referring to a particular dashboard there? For some of our dashboards, we do include all of our CCP students. And then for other dashboards, it's only our DPI, any students that came from DPI, so public and charter students. So, so it depends on whether we need to use data from the K-12 system or not as to whether all students or just our public and charter high school students are included. Now, if we're talking about transfer to private colleges, for all of dashboards looking at enrollment in colleges outside of CCP, we are connecting to the National Student Clearinghouse. So we're not just looking at public college information, we are including the privates as well. Can the dashboard also break down by high school and early college? So right now, this is an issue we have with our high school data is not great at the system office. We have a lot of students with missing high schools or just some generic like public North Carolina high school. So it makes it difficult for us to do analysis at the high school level or even at the early college level. So we have done a little bit at the high school level when we connect to DPI data, but then we're losing again all of our private and homeschooled students. So we may in the future add more information, at least for those public and charter school students. But at the moment, we don't have anything at that level. Also because we end up suppressing a lot of information. So once we break it down by high school and pathway and then try to look into different demographics, we end up suppressing a lot of that information. So John's asking about institution outside North Carolina. So anything where we're looking at subsequent enrollment in colleges after students graduate high school, we're getting any colleges that are part of the National Student Clearinghouse, which I think is like 96 or 98% of colleges. So that includes colleges outside of North Carolina, private colleges, and all of our public colleges as well. Tonya, can you clarify what you're asking for in your question? And any other questions you have, please feel free to share them. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so Elizabeth's been working to put up all of the data for the performance measures. So you need to contact whoever your data coordinator is. Thank you. So that looks like all the questions we have for now. So again, please feel free to email me if anything else comes up that you have a question about. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. And thank you for attending today.